Okay, today we're speaking about, Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. So the Gemara is like this. There was a question whether a certain animal was a treifa, and they brought the animal to, or the questionable part, the neck, to Rabbi Chana. He looked at it, and he said the animal's kosher, and he even went ahead and bought himself some of it, presumably that he could eat from it. So the Gemara says, really? How could he eat from it? But, it's a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. A Chacham had made a psak about this piece of meat, and we know that there's such a thing that a person should avoid a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. So the Gemara says, sorry about that. The Gemara says, this said there's a rule that you should avoid the Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is when it's something that was dependent on a Sevara, something, logical, someone had to figure something out. Rabbi Chana Gamrei Samach, Rabbi Chana was Samach on a Mesorah, which is to say in this case what happened was it was a Psukas Hagageres. There was a cut, there was a hole in the kane where the animal breathes through, and the question was that makes the animal to a treifa if roiv of the kane is cut. And the question was, is it roiv oivya, roiv chalala? He held that it has to be roiv ovya, and therefore he was able to decide it was mutter. So it was a question: which one, the roiv of what? Is it roiv this way or roiv of that way? How do you measure the roiv? Which direction do you measure roiv in? He said, I have a Mesorah a certain way, and therefore the animal is mutter. So, which is to say, the shaila depended totally on a question of din, not a question of judgment. It was a completely din. Either the din is this way or that way. He had a Mesorah a certain way, and in that case, there's no potential issue. There's no issue of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Now, of course, when you want to say is roiv of it cut, that's a judgment. Is roiv cut or not? But obviously, it must have been that it was obvious once you decided that it depends on roiv ovya. It was obvious that it was not roiv. That part was obvious. The question was just, but maybe it was roiv chalala, and which would have been then would have been aser. So there was no judgment involved. It was just a matter of din. Is it roiv chalala, roiv ovya, whatever that means? Not so important for today. And therefore, the Gemara says there's no problem. Okay. So what does that mean? If it's when it depends on a svara, that's why we say a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is aser. And Rashi explains that the reason is because when something is based on a svara, on a logic or on a judgment, an assessment of a situation, then there's always the Baal Nefesh will worry that maybe the Chacham misjudged, maybe he thought wrong, maybe he didn't think it through well enough, and that's the reason why for a person would be machmir to not eat the behema from Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. But if it's been on a Mesorah, then there's no judgment involved, and that's why it should be mutter. I'll mention Moshe has a different shot into what it means, whether the difference depends on a svara or not. He says the din of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham comes from a pasuk in Yecheskel. He says Yecheskel's Rebbe was Yirmiyahu Hanavi. So you think that he thought that Yirmiyahu Hanavi was maybe making a mistake in judgment? It's hard to imagine that you could think like that. So he says it's a special din about treifis with this an issue of reyesas and this and that. But then Rashi says it's hope shot, and it's why it doesn't apply to most of the dinim. Again, just so everybody else assumes like Rashi that the chashash is just in the cases where there's a problem of svara, meaning where there's a problem where he may have misjudged, and therefore the person who's being machmir is being machmir to say maybe the Rav misjudged the situation, and therefore he doesn't want to eat from it. Okay, now this din about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, and that it's only when it's a milsidab svara is brought in the Ramah and Siman Kuf Tezayin in your day. Okay, we'll see in a minute. It's also sort of brought in Shulchan Aruch, basically. Okay, now in a tshuva, the Ramah has a tshuva about this also, and he goes even a little bit further. He says like this: the Yerushalmi says that dayecha mash asur l'cha Torah. The Torah asked you enough things. We don't need to add more isurim, which is it's enough. Whatever the Torah said is asur, that's what you shouldn't eat. Don't make more isurim beyond that. So he asks himself. He says, he was talking about a certain case. He says, don't ask new things because it's enough. Like the Yerushalmi says, enough what the Torah asked. That's what we should do, and don't push it. Don't add things to that. So he says, wait a second. What about the fact that Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is aser? Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is aser means even though in din it's mutter, the Chacham who mattered it, he's a qualified person. He said it's mutter. So why would we aser that? Why would he say to avoid Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham? So he says, that rule of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham doesn't apply to the case he was talking about. Again, not relevant to us, but the case he's talking about not over here, because here's leka beisveika cloud. There's no suffix at all, and therefore it's mutter. Now, if you just read the Tshuvas Narot by itself without knowing anything else, you'd be wondering, why do I care if everyone eats it? Why, if everyone eats it, does that mean I'm allowed? I don't have to worry about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. What's the connection between those two? But once we saw that the Gemara says that Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is only an issue when we have a potential where it's a Sevara, maybe they're misjudging, maybe the Rav who answered this shaila is missing something, he's not getting exactly what went on, he's not, he's not judging it correctly, so that's the only time it's usher. So then we understand, if everyone's doing it, the whole world is permits this thing, that it's not a suffix. It's not that this Rav maybe made a mistake. It's a well tread din. Everyone does it this way. So Rama says in that kind of a case, again, like the Gemara says, it's not tali b'svara. It's more, so to speak, like a Mesorah. And in that case, there's no issue of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Okay, now let's move to a little different part of it, and that is the Pischei Teshuva brings from Isva Heter, who says that a person taka could do this to avoid a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. And he says you should know also if there was food that was in a treif kli, but it was in a kli sheni, or there was iser came into a food and it would have been batul b'shishim. So the Isva Heter says for that also you could be machmir and not eat that food. It's like sort of like a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. It took a psak to say that this food is mutter because kli sheni is kli sheni is not b'leya. That took a psak to decide that. So he says so you could choose to be machmir about that thing. And he says it's an example of kadesh atzmecha b'mutulach. Like be more careful than the Torah required you. And then he says, and you should know, there's a tshuva in the Maram, we'll talk about it in a second, who says that the Maram says, I won't eat meat at the same meal that I eat fish. Really, you're allowed to, you just can't eat them together. I won't even eat the same meal, even though it's completely mutter. So you see, so you see such a thing that a person could choose to avoid things like Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, like the Maram, and therefore if the kosher food was in a treif kli sheni, or there was a bitul b'shishim of iser into food, you could say I'm going to be machmir and I'm not going to eat. So that's what the Pischei Teshuva brings from this Heter. But he says the Pischei Teshuva says, I don't know what we're talking about. He said a kli sheni not being beleya and a bitul b'shishim are not tali b'svara. There's no svara to that part of it. It's obvious. It's an obvious din. It's a din well established that that's the din is that if Isra is batul b'shishim, then the food is mutter. An obvious din that we paskin that kli sheni is mutter. He says so. It's not tali b'svara. It's a well established din. So why would you say that this is an example of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham? No, it's not. The Gemara said specifically. It's not, even though Ramah brought it down, that it's not like that. And then he brings in the Teres Asham. Teres Asham was written by Hesed Yontif, who says. He says, if you look at the Maram, the Tshuva in the Maram says the only reason why he chose to be machmir was because one time there was still fish in his mouth when he was eating meat, and therefore, and it brings a right from a Gemara that if something once happens to someone, he ended up doing the wrong thing. He ended up eating meat and fish together, or almost eating meat and fish together. And he brings a raya that if it happens to a person that he comes to a place where he almost was over an isser, then he could choose to be machmir to avoid getting close to that case itself. But otherwise, you wouldn't do it. We wouldn't say Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. It's not a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham because it's an obvious din that you're allowed to eat meat and fish at the same meal. That's one thing. Teres Asham is another thing. He says, you think the Isva Heter is telling you that we should say in this case Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham? He says, well, go back a few pages in the Isva Heter. Go look early in the Isva Heter. He brings the Gemara Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, and that it's only by cases where it's tali b'svara. So he obviously he agrees. I don't know why he would argue, but he obviously himself even brings this whole Gemara. So how could it possibly be that he means to say is that you could that you would to really he would agree to such a thing that you'd aser a food which there was bitul b'shishim or in a kli sheni that mamash doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'll skip for a second and just tell you the mice is most people do not say like this Isva Heter. They say like Teres Asham, like the Pischei Teshuva implies that there's no place for a person to be machmir about a food in a kli sheni or a bitul b'shishim. The Teres Asham even calls this thing minus, and it's mamash and most people say you wouldn't do that. Just as an aside, before I get back to explain a drop for the Isser Heter. It's just interesting is that the Maram himself, in the tshuva of the Maram himself, when he talks about this tshuva that we're talking about, this Maram, he says, when I was younger, he says, Bimei Chorfi, I used to think that people who wouldn't eat meat and fish at the same meal, I used to say, I also thought they would mean him. That's exactly what the Torah's Arsham says. I also thought they would mean him. And then this story happened to me, and then I started being careful about it. So it's just interesting. They're both using this minus idea, whatever it's worth. Anyhow, so just to give an explanation, again, most people do not hold like the Isser Heter, but just to give an explanation for maybe what the Isser Heter means is, because again, it's really strange. It seems very strange what he's saying. It could be that it's true that in his discussion he talks about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, but it could be that really he's really focusing on a different thing, and that is a different sort of principle that the Gemara says, which is called harchik min hakiyur. Stay away from things that are disgusting. Which actually the Gemara we've been talking about mentions a few lines later. It mentions it. There, it's in a little bit different context. It means is you don't do things that look suspicious. Which is to say, is Rabbi Chana buying meat that he had just given a psak on, that looks very suspicious, it looks odd. So that the Gemara talks about it from that perspective. But really, harchik min hakiyur is used otherwise to say is stay away from things that have anything to do with Isser. So, which is to say is that it's not a matter of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham that maybe the Chacham made a mistake. It's not that maybe he made a mistake. No, you only have to worry that maybe he made a mistake when it's Milsul Taib Svara. This is not a Milsul Taib Svara. There's no Svara to this thing over here. But the point is that it has something to do with Isser, and it has to do with Isser. I want to stay away from it. It's sort of like I'm disgusted by it. I'm harchik min hakiyur. It's something disgusting. If the Ran Shem said this, us eat this food, I want to stay far away from it. Which punct happens to be right after the Ramah in that same simon also talks about Bitul. Go figure. But anyhow, like for example, let's say someone sneezed into my soup. Now, most people won't eat the soup afterwards. Why won't they eat it? Is it because they think that there's germs? I have a feeling it's not because they're really so much the germs, they're afraid of getting sick from eating it. It's just that it disgusts them. They said, I wouldn't want to eat that thing. So here also, there's Isser in my food. The Isser is Batal B'Shisha. I'm not worried about the technicality of what's over in Isser. But there's Isser in my food. So that's harchik min hakiyur. I'm worried about it bothers me to eat something the Baruch doesn't want for that to come into my system. So let me say it like this. Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is I'm afraid of a chait. I'm afraid that if I eat this, I might actually be over in Isser if the Chacham made a mistake. That's what I'm staying away from. As opposed to harchik min hakiyur, it's not I'm afraid of an Isser. It's just the food itself is repulsive to me, and I wouldn't want to eat it. Now, if this would be true, but if that's what the Isser Heter means, then the Isser Heter saying is Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham doesn't apply in cases like this. But there's another principle that would apply. Okay. Anyhow, so in other words, that would apply to here. It wouldn't apply to like Rabbi Chana, because in case of Rabbi Chana, there was no Isser at all. It's not kiyur at all. But it would apply, let's say, in the case of klisheni and things like that, as at least was close to Isser. Anyhow, back to where we were. Most people would agree, like Tarz Arsham says, that there's no problem with eating something where the Isser was in a klisheni, the food was in a klisheni, or there was Batal B'Shisha like that. Now, when the Ramah says this din about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, he says specifically that it applies for a Baal Nefesh. Okay, a person who's very careful about how he does his, about caring about mitzvahs. That's the person who should be makbid on that. Now, and if you think about it, the Gemara didn't actually say those words that it's only for Baal Nefesh, but it's pretty obvious why he says that, and that's because Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, if it was usher for everybody, then a chacham would never give a psak. The chacham would never be hoira. He would never give a psak on something, because every psak he gives, okay, I had to give a psak, that was tali b'svara, then you won't be allowed to eat it anyhow, so why would I tell you that it's mutter? So obviously the point is, when the chacham makes a hira'ah, that's perfectly fine, and every person can eat that. It's perfectly fine for people to eat it. But some people hold themselves to a higher standard. Those kind of people, they might want to avoid it. So and that's why in the Gemara doesn't ask 1,000 other people why, if something is mutter, why would anybody eat it? The Gemara, after Rabbi Chana bought it for himself, he was obviously a Baal Nefesh. Rabbi Chana is an Amoris. He's a person who'd be a Baal Nefesh. So to him, we surprised. You might say that the food is mutter, but why would you eat it? That seems a little strange. That's why the Gemara asked the Kashrus about him, of that he's a Baal Nefesh. And this similar to that is if you look in Mesorah in the beginning of Precious, in Perek Yudalad, which is about Precious, He says one type of precious is to be machmir for shitas that we don't paskin like. You know, to be the din is lahakal, but there's a shita that says you should be machmir. So being that a kind of precious is to be machmir to not eat to do that thing that some people hold as usher. Now, bearing that in mind, that's in Perek Yud Daled. In Perek Yud Gimel, when the Mesorah Yesharim starts describing precious, he says you should know. Precious is for people who've already become a tzaddik because they did Zehirus, Zerizus, and Nikiyas. They did the first 3 midas in the ladder of the Mesorah Yesharim. They did those. Now we're crossing a line. You're already a tzaddik because you did those 3, and now you want to become a chassid. So precious is the beginning of the path towards chassidus. That's like the second source of the second layer of what's going on here, which is to say that's the Baal Nefesh. Okay, the person who's precious, you don't get this idea of precious until you get to Perek Yud Daled. If you're a person who's already a tzaddik and now you want to be a chassid, now you're a Baal Nefesh. Okay, now that person you should think about being choshesh for shita yichidah and things like that. Okay, so also related to this idea that it's only for Baal Nefesh is that, which is really it's mutter. It's not usher to eat the Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. It's mutter to eat the Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, to eat that meat. But for a Baal Nefesh, he would be extra careful. It's an extra chumrah to do that. So the Shach says, the Shach is not exactly talking about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, but the Gemara says something that's almost exactly the same thing about eating a Beheimah kos, that is brought in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Yud Zayin and in Sim Kuf Tezayin. That the Shulchan Aruch brings that in also. So that a person, the Shach says that these kind of chumras, I'll say about Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, not exactly, but I'll say that's what it's about. But Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham is only for a case where the animal belongs to a goy. That's the meat you should avoid. If the animal belongs to a yid, he says it's not even midas chasidus to avoid eating the food, because if you won't eat the food, that's at the expense of this yid. That means some yid's going to lose his piece of meat. If people are not going to eat his meat, then he's going to lose money. He says the meat is 100% kosher. So if the din would be is you have to avoid a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, so then basically the meat is usher. I can't eat it. Okay, so I'm not going to eat it. I don't care that he's losing money. That's just life. But it's because really then it's mutter. You want to be extra careful. You can't be extra. It's like backwards. It's like perverse for you to say I'm going to be makbid about some special chumrah and cause a yid to have a loss. That would my be backwards. And going back to Mesorah Yesharim, he says in Perek Yud Daled when he talks about this idea about being machmir for shita yichidah, he says ubetanai shaloi yechumroi kuloi. Don't ever be machmir on this for a shita yichidah that ends up being a kula about some other aspect of your practice. The point is the same. We have to realize that you're not doing what you're required to do. You're going beyond the letter of the law. So it makes no sense to be machmir on something which calls you being makel on something that's actually minadin required. That marsh makes no sense. Okay, those are all examples of the fact that this is really mutter min hadin, and it's only a chumrah for bali nefesh, for special situations. Okay, you want to be machmir in the right situation, but not no matter what. Okay, so now let's think about some, we'll call them applications of this din. Really, they're not for regular people, as I've mentioned a bunch of times. It's really for bali nefesh, and they come to very, very specific situations, where it's tali b'svara. I'm going to mention certain cases that have come up, 3 things that have come up for relating to hashkachas, so to speak, where this issue sort of came up. One is like this. Rav Moshe says, he has a few Jews, and he talks about something called blended whiskey, and he says, I have many, many reasons, and he tells you all these different reasons why he thinks it's mutter. And even though he's very convinced that that's true, it's really mutter, he says, but a Baal Nefesh should avoid drinking them because it involved the Hayras Chacham. Okay? So, he says, in din it's mutter, but it's a Hayras Chacham, so, excuse me, that it's better to avoid it. Now, before I go on, you mentioned, Rav Moshe himself says that he himself therefore doesn't drink it. He says, but if someone would approach him and say to him, like, I guess to make a l'chaim with him, then he'll drink it. He says, because it would be mechsi ki yuara if he wouldn't drink it, which is very consistent with what the Shach I said beforehand. It's, you want to be machmir, you want to be extra careful. It's mutter. You want to be extra careful, but not at the expense of something else. So, mechsi kiyura is something wrong. That's a bad thing to do. You don't want to look like you're a balgaiva. So, you don't want to be machmir in a way that causes mechsi kiyura. So, if it's those two against each other, you drink the drink and ignore and avoid the Mesorah. So that's what Moshe says about blended whiskey. Now, whatever that shiloh was about blended whiskey, it's very intertwined with a shiloh that people nowadays are more familiar with, which is about drinking whiskey that was aged in sherry casks. Okay, the reasons to be makel about this blended whiskey are very intertwined and they're very connected with that. And therefore, since that was a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, Rav Shechter said is the OU he didn't think OU should allow whiskey that was aged in sherry casks to be served at an OU certified event. He said a lot of people who are there wouldn't want to drink this if they knew what the shilohs were. He said probably they don't, but even if they did, they probably wouldn't want to drink it. So the hashgacha should take that into consideration and therefore not allow it to be used. Now, at first glance, it's a little strange because we saw that only Bali Nefesh have to avoid a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Rabbi himself says it's for Bali Nefesh. Rabbi Shechter also says it's a Beheimah, like a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. So why do we have to be makbid on that for hashgacha? That's for everybody. Hashgacha is not for Bali Nefesh. Hashgacha is for every regular guy in the street. So why do we makbid on it? So it could be that Rav Shechter was saying, that's why Rav Shechter said is, if the people knew, they would want to be makbid on this thing. If the people were aware of it, this is the kind of thing that even like regular kind of people would be makbid if they knew that this was a shiloh going on over here. Okay, so it's an unusual situation where it's a shiloh of a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. That's the reason to be machmir, but yet it would apply to many people. Okay, but it could be it's a different thing, and that is it could be that he thinks a hashgacha has to hold themselves to a higher standard, and they should be trying to avoid Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. At least cases where you could at least reasonable that's to do that. It could be that that's what he's thinking, that hashgacha has to act at least where possible to avoid a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Now, it might be related to something else Rav Shechter would say, which is, and he didn't say it for this, but he says in other contexts he would say is that he says if you have the rabbi of a community and the community needs a mikvah, the rabbi should build the mikvah according to whatever he thinks is correct. Mutter, usher, whatever he thinks is the way the din is, how you should build a mikvah, that's what he should do. But if that mikvah is going to be used by people who are visiting and people from other communities, it's a bigger city and like all kinds of people come through and use the mikvah in that city, then that Rav has to build the mikvah to go along with all legitimate shitas that there are. Because the guy who's coming from the next city over, who he's coming from a different country, he's coming from a different city, he might not, his Rav, his community might not pass like this. So for your own community, you could pass on whoever you want to. When you pass for everybody, you have to think about those other people also. So in a sense, the hashgacha is has to think about all the different opinions that are out there, and when they give the hashgacha, they have to think broader than just what the ikra din is or what we think is mutter or not. So we have to think a little broader. Now, of course, there's a limit to that. It doesn't mean that every time there's a shiloh, we should say, is anybody machmer on this thing and go along the chumrah. That's also unreasonable. But within reason, that's what he's saying is, and this is an example where he thought it was appropriate that you should be machmer on this, even though it's sort of a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Another case, this was Rabelski. Rabelski had a shita, had a chiddush, this very unusual, novel idea about time passing through the walls in a steam system, and from inside the pipes to outside the pipes. For people who know, I'm not going to talk about the details. It's called this 10% rule. He had this very mechudishtik idea about how blias do or don't transfer, and he said like this. He says, "Lamais is, even though I think that it's correct." He says, really, we should try to avoid this kind of chiddush that I'm telling you over here. We should avoid having a type of a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. In other words, he thinks that he's right. He even allowed it in cases where there was no eitzah to get around it. But if it's possible to avoid it, we should, because this was a real judgment. In other words, to say this is not something with a Mesorah. This is not something a clear din where it's obvious that the din is like this or that. No, not at all. This is his own judgment. Not only is it a judgment, it's a judgment where lots of people would be surprised or would not agree with him about what he had to say about that. And therefore, he said is, if it's possible, if there was an alternative, like in the situation he was talking about, then go for it, and you should not allow this kula, because it's a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. So here it's both the things you mentioned before, and here it's a lot of people who would know about it would be weary of being mekel, and had to do with things that we were going to give hashgacha to. So the hashgacha is sort of thinking about everybody out there, and therefore, but here it's a more obvious Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, more obvious than in the previous case. and therefore, I should take that back. No, it's the same as the previous case. Both of them, it's ta'i b'svara, and therefore he said we should avoid giving hashgacha on that. Okay, so those two cases we could sort of understand. The case that's difficult, the third case, which is hard to understand, is some hashgachas will tell people that if you go to a Starbucks, you can't drink a plain coffee. I'm not talking about the more advanced drink. I'm talking about just the plain black coffee. They'll tell you can't drink it. Now, they say, now the truth is that the Starbucks, a lot of the stores, depending on how they are, will wash trafe dishes, like really trafe from meat, trafe dishes, together with the equipment that you use for making coffee. But if you dig into exactly how the washing is done and how the equipment is used, it turns out that the coffee is really mutter because the blias are on the klisheni, blias are bata b'shishim, and the din is they're really mutter. We're not going to talk about today why that's true. It's not relevant. That is in truth. We've talked about it other times. Now that case where the blias are going to be mutter, are not going to make the food treif because it's in the klisheni, or because it's bata b'shishim, that's exactly the case that the Isser Heter says that that Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham applies, and everybody else says no, it's not true. It's not nilsel ta'i b'svara. This is an obvious. It's a beferish din that those things are mutter. Okay, no one says that you're not supposed to, that you should be machmir on that thing. I'm not. No, the Isser Heter said that, but everyone disagrees with that and says that no, that's not a Beheimah. It's not even a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, even for a Baal Nefesh. So why should we be machmir on that thing? Now, some said we should be machmir because we have to give people food that's free of shilas. Okay, not clear at all where such a concept came from. That we have to give people things that are free of any shilah. I'm not clear where that came from at all. But of course, it's not even accurate because the hashgachas themselves, even the things that they give hashgacha to, they have shilas on things, and then they answer the shilas, and they decide something is mutter, and then they allow it, and they decide also, then they don't allow it. So they don't give, even when they give hashgacha on food, they give it with shilas, that there were shilas to it. Kosher came over here, they're not even giving hashgacha, they're just telling you if you could eat it or not eating it. So it's not clear where that logic comes from altogether, or how that would apply over here. Rather, it's more of a question of Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. Well, like we saw beforehand, this is not even a Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham. This is a food where there's a clear din. This is a Mesorah. Klisheni doesn't make food treif b'diavad. Bitul b'shishim makes the food mutter also. It's not judgment. So l'chara in that kind of case, there would be no reason to avoid it. It's not even Beheimah Shehorah Bo Chacham, and even if it's for a Baal Nefesh.